Millionaire betrayed wife because of mistress but life turned against him. Welcome to Wise Stories. Please do remember to subscribe, like and share this video. Ethan Daniels sat in his plush home office, surrounded by walls lined with expensive bookshelves and sleek modern furniture. The warm glow of the desk lamp illuminated his face, but the light did little to soften the hard lines of dissatisfaction etched across it. Outside, the quiet suburban neighborhood was calm, the faint hum of crickets barely audible through the thick glass windows. Inside, the scent of Julia's cooking wafted through the air, a comforting mix of spices and roasted chicken. Yet, for Ethan, the aroma only deepened his restlessness. "This is my life now," Ethan muttered under his breath, flipping through a financial report. His pen hovered over the paper, but his mind was elsewhere. Day in, day out, the same routine. He leaned back in his leather chair, staring at the ceiling as a wave of boredom washed over him. Downstairs, Julia hummed softly as she stirred a pot on the stove. Her movements were deliberate, practiced. She had spent years perfecting her recipes to suit Ethan's tastes, always ensuring he returned to a warm meal and a tidy home. As the scent of dinner grew stronger, Julia glanced at the clock and smiled. Ethan should be coming down soon, she thought, wiping her hands on a towel. Upstairs, Ethan's phone buzzed. He absent-mindedly reached for it, expecting another work email. Instead, his eyes widened as he read the name on the screen, Chloe. His heart skipped a beat. With a glance at the door to ensure it was shut, Ethan opened the message. "Chloe, hey, stranger. Missing me yet?" A faint smile tugged at Ethan's lips. Chloe had a way of making even the most mundane words sound thrilling. He hesitated before typing back. "Ethan, you know I shouldn't be talking to you right now." The reply came almost instantly. "Chloe, and yet, here you are. Can't resist me, can you?" Ethan chuckled softly, shaking his head. His guilt lingered, a shadow in the back of his mind, but Chloe's words felt like a lifeline to a version of himself he thought he'd lost, a man who was daring, exciting, and free. He leaned forward, placing the phone down and rubbing his temples. The sound of Julia's footsteps on the stairs jolted him. He quickly locked his phone and picked up the report again, pretending to read. Julia poked her head into the room, her face glowing with a gentle smile. "Dinner's almost ready," she said. "You've been up here all day. You should take a break." Ethan forced a smile, avoiding her eyes. "I'll be down in a bit. Just wrapping up some work." Julia nodded, her smile faltering slightly. "Okay. Don't let it get cold." She turned and walked back downstairs, her footsteps fading away. As soon as she was gone, Ethan exhaled sharply and grabbed his phone again. He stared at Chloe's profile picture, a photo of her laughing on a beach, her hair wild in the wind. She was everything Julia wasn't. Where Julia was calm and nurturing, Chloe was fiery and unpredictable. He knew it wasn't fair to compare them, but he couldn't help himself. "This isn't who I am," Ethan whispered, but the words felt hollow. Deep down, he wasn't so sure anymore. Later that night, as Ethan and Julia sat across from each other at the dining table, the tension was palpable. Julia tried to make conversation, asking about his day, but Ethan's answers were curt and distracted. "How's the new project coming along?" she asked, her voice gentle. "It's fine," Ethan replied, barely looking up from his plate. Julia studied him, her brows knitting together. "You seem distant lately. Is everything okay?" Ethan hesitated, forcing a smile. "I'm just tired. Work's been stressful." Julia nodded slowly, her instincts telling her there was more to his mood than work, but she didn't press further. Instead, she reached for his hand. "You know I'm here if you need to talk, right?" Ethan flinched at her touch but quickly covered it with a nod. "Yeah. Thanks." That night, as Julia slept peacefully beside him, Ethan lay awake, staring at the ceiling. His phone buzzed on the nightstand, and he grabbed it quickly, careful not to wake her. "Chloe, can't sleep? Thinking about me?" Ethan glanced at Julia, her face serene in the moonlight, then back at the screen. He hesitated for a moment before typing. "Ethan, yeah. I can't stop thinking about you." The guilt surged again, but he pushed it down. For now, the excitement Chloe brought felt worth the risk. Over the next few days, Ethan found himself retreating further into his secret world with Chloe. He would linger in his car after work to talk to her, send her gifts under the guise of business expenses, and spend hours replaying their conversations in his mind. Julia, ever perceptive, noticed the change but chose to remain silent. Instead, she busied herself with keeping the household running, her love for Ethan driving her to hold on to hope. But as the days turned into weeks, the distance between them grew, and Julia couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was pulling Ethan away. Ethan, consumed by his newfound thrill, failed to see the quiet pain in Julia's eyes. He had convinced himself that he deserved this, that the monotony of his life justified his betrayal. But life, as Julia often said, had a way of teaching hard lessons to those who forgot its wisdom. The air in the Daniels household had grown heavy with unspoken words. Julia noticed the changes in Ethan the way only a wife of 10 years could. He came home later each night, the scent of unfamiliar perfume sometimes lingering faintly on his clothes. His phone, once casually left on the kitchen counter, was now always locked and tucked into his pocket or by his side. Julia lay awake in bed one night, the soft glow of the bedside lamp illuminating her thoughtful face. Ethan was in his home office, the door firmly shut. He had been spending more time in there recently, claiming he had work to finish. Julia didn't need to look far to know something was wrong. She sighed deeply, turning her gaze to the small framed photograph on the nightstand. It was of their wedding day. Julia, radiant in her traditional attire, and Ethan, younger and full of life, smiling down at her. The man in the photo felt like a stranger now. The next morning, as Ethan rushed out of the house with barely a word, Julia stood in the kitchen, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. Her mind raced with questions, but her upbringing taught her not to act on impulse. "I will not be the woman who fights blindly," she whispered to herself. "I need guidance." After cleaning up the breakfast dishes, Julia prepared for a trip to her ancestral village. She gathered a basket of offerings, ripe fruits, kola nuts, and a small bottle of palm oil. She had made this journey many times before, but today, the weight in her heart made the path feel heavier. The village was alive with the sounds of children playing and elders chatting under the shade of trees. Julia's feet stirred up small clouds of dust as she made her way to Mama Iridi's compound. Mama Iridi, a revered elder in the community, was known for her wisdom and her ability to see beyond what others could. When Julia arrived, Mama Iridi was seated on a low stool under a sprawling baobab tree, weaving a mat. Her movements were slow but deliberate, each strand of raffia falling into place with practiced ease. She looked up as Julia approached, her piercing eyes softening with recognition. "Julia, my child," Mama Iridi said, setting the mat aside. "I have been expecting you." Julia knelt respectfully, placing the basket at Mama Iridi's feet. "Mama, I need your guidance," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "Ethan, he is not the man I once knew. There is distance between us. I fear there is another woman." Mama Iridi nodded slowly, her gaze distant as though she were peering into another world. "The ancestors speak of a storm, child," she said. "It swirls around your home, threatening to uproot what is sacred. But remember this, storms do not destroy what is built on a strong foundation." Julia's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "What should I do, Mama? Should I confront him? Should I leave?" Mama Iridi reached out and took Julia's hands in her own. "Do nothing in haste, Julia. Patience is your strength. Speak to your ancestors. They will guide your steps. And trust that justice, both spiritual and earthly, will find its way to those who betray sacred bonds." Julia bowed her head, feeling a sense of calm for the first time in weeks. "Thank you, Mama. I will remain strong." When Julia returned home, she went straight to her small altar in the bedroom. It was a simple setup, a clean white cloth, a clay bowl for offerings, and framed photos of her late parents and grandparents. She lit a candle and knelt before the altar, her hands clasped in prayer. "Ancestors, guide me," she murmured. "Give me the strength to endure this storm and the wisdom to know when to act." The candle flickered, its flame steady despite the draft from the window. Julia took it as a sign and resolved to stay patient. She would let Ethan's choices reveal themselves in time. Ethan, meanwhile, had grown bolder in his affair. He spent more time with Chloe, whisking her away on lavish weekend trips and showering her with expensive gifts. One evening, as they dined in a luxurious restaurant, Chloe laughed, running her fingers over a gold bracelet Ethan had bought her. "You're spoiling me," she teased, her eyes sparkling. "You deserve it," Ethan replied with a smug smile, though a small part of him felt the weight of his actions. "What about your wife?" Chloe asked casually, sipping her wine. "Does she suspect anything?" Ethan leaned back in his chair, waving off the question. "Julia's too reserved to challenge me. She wouldn't dare." Back at home, Julia's quiet resilience began to unsettle Ethan. He noticed how she didn't nag him about coming home late or question him about his phone. She continued to cook his meals, keep the house spotless, and offer him a warm smile whenever he walked through the door. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, Julia spoke softly. "Ethan, is everything all right? You've been so busy lately." Ethan stiffened, caught off guard. "Everything's fine. Just a lot of work," he replied quickly, avoiding her gaze. Julia nodded, her face calm. "If you ever need to talk, I'm here." "Thanks," Ethan mumbled, standing up. "I'm heading to bed." Julia watched him leave, her heart heavy but her resolve unshaken. She knew Ethan's secrets would eventually come to light. Until then, she would remain strong, trusting in the wisdom of her ancestors and the justice of the universe. Julia lit another candle that night, whispering her prayers to the ancestors. She didn't need to confront Ethan, life would do that for her. In her heart, she believed that truth, like water, always found its way to the surface. Ethan Daniels leaned back in the leather chair of Chloe's apartment, the tension thick in the air. Chloe paced the room, her heels clicking sharply on the hardwood floor. Her face, once so inviting and playful, was now twisted with anger. "I told you, Ethan," she snapped, crossing her arms. "I need the money. And I need it now." Ethan's patience, already stretched thin, began to fray. "Chloe, I've already given you more than enough. Do you think money just falls into my lap?" Chloe laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. "Isn't that what you rich types always say? Stop pretending you're struggling. Either you transfer the money, or I'll tell your precious wife everything." Ethan's stomach churned. "You wouldn't dare," he said, his voice low and trembling with both anger and fear. "Oh, wouldn't I?" Chloe shot back, her eyes gleaming with malice. She stepped closer, jabbing a manicured finger into his chest. "Don't forget, Ethan. You came to me. You wanted excitement, didn't you? Well, it's going to cost you." That night, Ethan left Chloe's apartment feeling drained and furious. As he drove through the quiet streets, his mind raced. He had thought Chloe was different, someone who genuinely cared about him. Instead, she had been playing him all along. At home, he poured himself a glass of whiskey and sat in the darkened living room. His phone buzzed incessantly with messages from Chloe, each one more threatening than the last. Ethan's hands trembled as he read them. She wanted an obscene amount of money, and he knew that even if he gave in, she would only come back for more. As the days passed, Ethan's problems multiplied. A major business deal that had been months in the making suddenly fell through. Rumors of mismanagement began circulating among his investors, and clients started pulling out. "What's happening to us, Ethan?" his assistant asked during an emergency meeting. "Our numbers are plummeting. We need to act fast." But Ethan barely heard her. His mind was consumed by thoughts of Chloe and her threats. Every time his phone buzzed, he felt a fresh wave of panic. The final blow came when his trusted business partner, someone he had considered a close friend, was discovered embezzling funds. The betrayal left Ethan reeling. His company, once a symbol of his success, was now teetering on the edge of collapse. Desperate for solace, Ethan turned back to Chloe, hoping to reason with her. But when he arrived at her apartment, it was empty. The furniture was gone, the walls bare. Chloe had vanished, leaving behind nothing but a bitter silence. Panicked, Ethan checked his bank accounts. A large sum of money was missing, withdrawn over the past few weeks. He clenched his fists, realizing that Chloe had been stealing from him long before their argument. She played me, he muttered to himself, the weight of his choices crashing down on him. She used me and left me with nothing. Broken and humiliated, Ethan returned home that evening. As he stepped through the door, the familiar warmth of the house felt suffocating. He looked around at the place he had once called a sanctuary, now a reminder of everything he had lost. Julia was in the kitchen, her back to him as she washed dishes. She didn't turn around when he entered, but Ethan could sense that something was different. The usual calm in the house had shifted, replaced by a quiet tension. "Julia," he began, his voice hoarse. I need to talk to you." Julia turned slowly, drying her hands on a towel. Her face was calm, but her eyes held a depth of pain Ethan hadn't noticed before. "I already know, Ethan," she said quietly, placing the towel on the counter. Ethan froze. You know?" Julia nodded, her gaze steady. "Chloe sent you a message earlier today. It came through while your phone was charging in the living room." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I wrote it down, just in case you'd try to deny it." Ethan's heart sank as she read the message aloud. "I'm done waiting, Ethan. Either you pay me, or I'll tell Julia everything. Your choice." There was no use lying. Ethan slumped into a chair, his head in his hands. "Julia, I'm sorry. I don't even know how it got this far." Julia held up a hand, cutting him off. "Don't," she said, her voice firm but calm. "Don't insult me with excuses. I gave you my trust, Ethan. For 10 years, I stood by your side, believing in you, loving you. And this is how you repay me." Ethan looked up at her, tears brimming in his eyes. "I made a mistake, Julia. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but Julia shook her head. "This isn't just about forgiveness, Ethan. It's about the choices you made. You ignored every bit of wisdom I tried to share with you. Do you remember what I told you when we got married? The proverb my mother taught me, when you betray what is sacred, the spirits will turn against you. You didn't listen, and now look at where we are." Ethan felt the weight of her words. He had dismissed her proverbs as old-fashioned, irrelevant to his modern life. Now, they felt like a prophecy he had foolishly ignored. Julia stepped closer, her voice softening but still firm. "I prayed for guidance, Ethan. I prayed for strength. And now, I know what I need to do." "What does that mean?" Ethan asked, his voice trembling. "It means," Julia said, straightening her shoulders, "that I will no longer carry the weight of your choices. If you want to rebuild your life, you will have to do it without me." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. "Julia, please, don't do this." But Julia had already made up her mind. She turned and walked away, leaving Ethan alone in the quiet house, the echoes of his mistakes surrounding him. Ethan sat at the edge of the bed in the guest room, his face buried in his hands. For the past 3 nights, sleep had eluded him. Whenever he closed his eyes, he saw visions of Julia's ancestors. They appeared in his dreams as stern figures dressed in traditional attire, their faces lined with wisdom and disappointment. "You betrayed her," one of them would say, their voice echoing like a distant drumbeat. "How do you repair what you have broken?" another would ask, their gaze piercing through him. Ethan would wake in a cold sweat, their words ringing in his ears. he couldn't escape the guilt or the reality of the damage he had caused. Meanwhile, Julia was at Mama Iridi's small, humble home in the village. The elder's home smelled of burning incense and herbs, a calming contrast to the turmoil in Julia's heart. Mama Iridi sat cross-legged on a woven mat, her gray hair tied back and her wise eyes observing Julia carefully. "Child," Mama Iridi began, stirring a bowl of herbs in her lap, "you carry a heavy burden. Speak your heart." Julia hesitated before finally saying, "Mama, I don't know what to do. Ethan says he's sorry, but how can I trust him after everything he's done?" Mama Iridi nodded slowly. "Trust, my child, is like a clay pot. Once broken, it can be mended, but the cracks will always remain. The question is, can you live with those cracks?" Julia's eyes welled with tears. "I still love him, Mama, but I'm afraid he'll hurt me again." Mama Iridi leaned forward, taking Julia's hand in hers. "Forgiveness is powerful, Julia. It frees you from the poison of anger. But forgiveness without change is meaningless. If he is to stay, he must show you, not with words, but with actions, that he has changed. Follow your heart, but remember, your heart must also protect itself." Back at home, Ethan made his first attempt to apologize again, finding Julia in the garden she loved so much. She was tending to her flowers, her hands gently brushing over the petals of the hibiscus blooms. "Julia," Ethan began cautiously, standing a few steps away, "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I need you to know how sorry I am. I see now how much I've hurt you, and myself." Julia didn't look up. "It's not just about being sorry, Ethan," she said softly, her voice steady. "It's about proving to me that you can be the man I thought I married." Ethan knelt on the grass beside her. "Tell me what I need to do." "I'll do anything, Julia. Just tell me how to fix this." She finally turned to face him, her eyes filled with both sadness and determination. "This isn't something I can tell you, Ethan. You have to figure it out for yourself. I need time to think about us. Until then, you need to work on yourself." Ethan took her words to heart. Over the following weeks, he began to make changes. He donated a portion of what was left of his wealth to local charities, including a community center Julia had always supported. He started reading about African traditions and proverbs, many of which Julia had shared with him over the years but he had dismissed as old-fashioned. One evening, Julia caught him sitting in the living room, reading a book about African philosophy. She paused in the doorway, surprised. "What are you reading?" she asked. Ethan looked up, a little sheepish. "It's about the wisdom of Proverbs. I realized I ignored so much of what you tried to teach me. I thought, maybe it's time I listened." Julia's expression softened, though she said nothing. She turned and walked away, but for the first time in weeks, a faint glimmer of hope stirred in her heart. Despite his efforts, the road to redemption was not easy. Ethan struggled with guilt and the fear that his actions might never be enough. Julia remained guarded, her interactions with him polite but distant. One day, he found himself at the doorstep of Mama Iridi's home. She greeted him with a raised eyebrow and a knowing smile. "So, the prodigal husband comes to seek wisdom," she said, motioning for him to sit. Ethan bowed his head. "Mama, I've made so many mistakes. I want to fix them, but I don't know how. Julia deserves better." Mama Iridi studied him for a moment before replying. "True change begins when you stop trying to fix things for others and start fixing yourself. Julia's forgiveness is not a prize for you to win, it's a reflection of the man you choose to become. Do you understand?" Ethan nodded slowly, her words sinking deep into his heart. Months passed, and Ethan continued his journey of self-reflection and growth. He took on volunteer work at the community center, mentored young entrepreneurs, and immersed himself in the values Julia had always cherished. His transformation was gradual but genuine. One evening, Julia found him sitting outside under the moonlight, a thoughtful expression on his face. She hesitated before joining him, sitting on the bench beside him. The moon is beautiful tonight, she said softly. Ethan glanced at her, his eyes filled with gratitude. It is. And so are you, Julia. She looked away, a faint smile playing on her lips. You've changed, Ethan. I can see it. But change takes time. Trust takes time. I know, he replied earnestly. I'm willing to wait as long as it takes, Julia. You mean everything to me. They sat in silence, the cool night air wrapping around them. For the first time in a long while, the distance between them felt a little smaller. Though their journey was far from over, Ethan and Julia began to rebuild, step by cautious step. The scars of betrayal remained, but they were a reminder of the lessons learned and the strength they had found in themselves and each other. In the end, Ethan realized that true wealth was not in his bank account but in the loyalty, love, and wisdom that surrounded him. For Julia, forgiveness became a testament to her resilience and the enduring power of her heritage. Together, they discovered that even broken bonds could be mended with patience, humility, and an unyielding belief in second chances.